welcome, friends. It's good to see so many faces. I know we have some new subscribers this month as well, so a special welcome goes out to all of you. I am delighted, along with our host, Pete Becky, to welcome Professor Glenn Loury to our virtual salon for this month, as we have all been eagerly making our questions ready for Glenn's memoir, Late Admissions. I know that you all have many questions, and I know Pete does as well. So I'm going to turn it immediately over to Pete so that we can just get rolling. The only reminder that I'll share is, as usual, if there are any links or other information that we share in the chat, Shelley will make all of that available to you in the Liberty Fund portal following our conversation today. So again, thank you for taking the time to join us today. Professor Loury, thank you very much for agreeing to join us today. And Pete, it's all yours.
Okay, everyone can hear me fine? Yep, everyone good? All right, Glenn, thank you very much for joining us. I'm going to jump right in. Just very quick introduction. Glenn Loury is the Merton Schultz Professor of Social Sciences at Brown University. He has a long, distinguished career, and he's the author of this book that we've been reading this month, Late Admissions. So I'm going to limit myself to just a few questions to start with Glenn and I. And, the first one is a kind of a economics question in a weird way. But since you've written a memoir, I don't need to really start with a kind of question about your origin story because we've already been reading it. But I want to start with a question that you raise in the preface, which is about your strategic interaction and how we might think about that in a broader implications than just between the relationship between the author and his audience, but also is the same strategic game being played between a a teacher and a student, a politician and a voter, the economist and the public, and then what is the implications of this? Just to give you an idea, what I'm thinking is Danny Roderick wrote a paper many years ago called "Promises, Promises." And in that paper, it's an EJ paper, he argues that you have to overshoot in order to get the credible commitment. If you just did the optimal amount, you could never get the credible commitment. So you have to actually overshoot to get the people to buy in. In some sense, that's what I see you as doing in here. And I wanted to know if you agree with that interpretation and how you see the general application of that for human interaction in general.
Well, it's a signaling problem. The author, the speaker, has characteristics that are not observable that he wants to credibly communicate, and that's the general issue. I wrote this paper on self-censorship a long time ago that was published in Rationality and Society back in the 1990s. And to keep this a compact response to your question, I won't try to describe that paper in detail, but just to say that I was interested in the strategic aspects of public expression. I'm careful about what I say because I don't want people to think I'm a racist or I'm anti-Semite or, whatever. And so the range of things that can credibly and effectively get communicated might be limited by a concern about how people interpret what one says. And I read in getting myself geared up for writing that paper, a number of different authors. Tom Schelling, my colleague at the Kennedy School, was an influence. Michael Spence was an influence. Irving Goffman, the sociologist, was in Presentation of Self in Everyday Life, and so got used to thinking about this problem, the problem of credibly communicating the characteristics about myself that can't be observed or verified directly. And it occurred to me in writing the memoir that I was facing that problem. I mean, as you know from having read the book, I'm engaged in a self-revelatory enterprise there. I mean, of course, I could have taken a different approach to the book. I could have instead of candor and the raw, brutal, honest reportage that I think the book represents, I could have crafted it as a self-portrait that was much more flattering and in that sense, much more conventional. Uh, but I didn't want to do that, and we could go into the reasons why. I think that's going to require some psychological plumbing of depths on my part to get to what. Why did I feel that this confessional
Yeah.
was necessary? I'm looking back at my own life. I'm not proud of everything that I see, but I am proud of having surmounted the obstacles, some of them self-imposed, and having arrived at a certain place, both in my personal and family life, as well as in my professional and intellectual life, in my spiritual quest, and so on. Uh, and I'm laying a lot of stuff bare, and I realize that the reader may be tempted to uh, draw certain unflattering conclusions about me or about my character. I'm a suspicious uh, figure here in this confessional, and so I'm trying to exert some influence over this game of this kind of image management uh, uh, problematic that I've set up for myself. Um, I don't know. Am I being responsive to you, Peter?
Yeah, yeah.
I'm
I
It's
just
kind of a
my
free association here.
no, no, no. It's if you go to just the end of your preface, I was just struck, you know, tell you
Okay,
that I
now
have
I
abandoned. Can you hear
Here,
me?
we lost you for a minute there. Do you mind repeating yourself? If we go to the end of your preface, was the last thing I heard you say.
yeah.
Can you hear me now?
Yeah, I hear you now.
Okay, it's just this, I'm going to tell you that I've lied because I need you to believe me. I'm going to tell you that I've deceived those closest to me because I need you to trust me. I'm going to tell you that I have abandoned people who needed me because I need you to stick with me. And I was just wondering, I think those are unbelievably profound statements, and it relates to so many other issues. So, like when I was read your paper back in the 90s. It was also at a time that I was reading a lot of Timur Kuran and
Yeah,
private truths and public lies and all these kind of things, because these were questions having to do with the post-Soviet reality as well as any kind of other society, and how this game that must be played between a regime that we don't trust but a regime that we rely on in the shift of a regime is going to be. So rather than having the more things change, the more they stay the same, you had to somehow believe that it was going to be different than in the past. And so I think this relationship that you've identified in this signaling game has I mean, obviously, because you mentioned Schelling and everyone else, has these huge implications from the micro to the macro. And that's all I was, I was intrigued by that idea. That's all.
Peter, I felt that I needed some cover. I have in fact lied, cheated, betrayed, abandoned. That's the actual truth of my life. That's
Right.
not the only truth, but that's the actual fact. As I said, I could have kept that hidden. I could have tried to cover it up. I could have been, in a sense, dishonest. Uh, but I don't think I would have been spending my time in a worthy fashion.
Right.
Some of this is about coming to terms with myself, and
So, yeah.
given that I'm committed to the raw, bare, unbearably embarrassing, humiliating, self-deprecating project, I thought I needed cover. So this device, I'm playing a game with you, the reader. You don't
Yeah.
have to believe anything I tell you. After all, this is all self-interested manipulation that's going on here. But I tell you what, here's an insight. if I say stuff about myself that practically nobody would want anyone to think was true of them, and yet I
Right.
confess it, you can be pretty sure that you're dealing with a guy who's going to be straight up with you.
Yeah.
Which
Yeah.
means that maybe at the end of the day, when I make my indirect plea, please don't think poorly of me. I'm just struggling with the confrontations of life and the temptations and the snares and the, whatever. We're all enmeshed in this same situation. And I've had the courage to tell you the truth about myself. Please think well of me. Please think well of me. Uh, I thought that my setup with the problem of self-regard
Yeah.
with and I'm so happy that you appreciated that paragraph because I'm very, very proud of it, of a kind of craft that's involved there. I thought it was my best shot,
Yeah.
my best shot at coming out not being a scumbag.
Yeah. I mean, I understand that, and I really appreciate that in the book, and I think it's actually not only an interesting way, but it's actually a truth, a fundamentally profound truth about human interactions. My second question has to do with the economics profession in a large sense. We read Jennifer Burns's book on Milton Friedman.
Yeah.
And a large part of that book isn't just about Friedman's ascent to, the status, iconic status that Friedman has, but also the sociology of the profession. In that book, um, one of the things that's fascinating to me is that when Friedman went to get his PhD at Columbia, he's a PhD student, he taught the price theory course. And it was introduced. It was the first time they taught price theory at Columbia because they didn't teach price theory before went there. They would have, 50 years earlier, but then they abandoned it. And he had to go bring that back. Think about that. A PhD student teaching other PhD students about price theory. It's reminiscent of what, Murphy and them are trying to do now by having the Chicago price theory camp, right? But so you're in the kind of a very unique position because you're at Northwestern. You're in proximity to Chicago. You're at Chicago right at the time that Friedman is eventually, in his greatest victory, let's say the presidential address to the AEAs, on the role of money and everything. And yet, so you have them right there, but then you go to MIT, which of course is his, I don't know what the right words, major interlocutors, Samuelson versus Friedman kind of idea. Yet it's at the kind of tail end of their battle. But yet you have the rise of rational expectations coming on, all while you're just a very young, and you're at all the main centers. I was just wondering if you could give a sense of that. Was it just the tug and pull of science that's going on, or is there some deeper sociological aspects that you saw going on in the economics profession?
I'm not sure I'm well placed to comment insightfully on that, although I think it's an important set of issues. I was at Northwestern as an undergraduate. Although I lived in Chicago, lived on the South Side, and knew Hyde Park, and knew of the University of Chicago. I really didn't know a whole lot about Chicago, about the Chicago School in economics and all of that. I only later kind of uh, began to appreciate uh, the uh, significance of the distinction of method, of kind of philosophical commitment,
Yeah,
uh, and so on. I mean, for example, on the macro side, I didn't know from rational expectations and monetary, whatever. I mean, I knew what Franco Modigliani and Paul Samuelson said in the lectures that I was sitting in at MIT.
yeah,
I knew that there was a fault line in the profession that separated people's approach to these issues, but I didn't really deeply appreciate it. Lucas's expectations and the neutrality of money. I remember reading that paper with Peter Diamond in my second year as a PhD student at MIT, and I was blown away. But I wasn't blown away by the implications of, you can't really get real GDP to change its trajectory significantly by manipulating the money supply. I was blown away by the fixed point theorems and the dynamic programming mathematics of the
Yeah.
elegant beauty of that paper. And I came to appreciate Bob Lucas for that kind of genius in advancing important economic insight through technically sophisticated method.
Yeah.
Um, when I read Stigler or Becker or Coase or Posner or whatnot, I saw price theory at work for sure. And I appreciated the idea that you could get a lot of mileage out of some relatively straightforward arbitrage ideas and people responding to incentives and implicit markets and
Yeah.
that kind of thing. But I didn't have perspective. I mean, as I say in the book, my teachers at Northwestern said, "Don't go to Chicago," even though it was a very natural thing to do because it was right around the corner. Because you'll come out a conservative, and they had fairly, I think, limited appreciation of. I mean, I may have come out a conservative. At the end of the day, I came out a conservative anyway. So
Yeah.
uh, but uh, I don't know. Again, I'm not sure I'm being responsive to you,
No,
Pete.
I think you're so first, let me just say something that one of the things in the book that struck me about how much it's communicated how much you love the technical nuances of economics in your discussion of supply and demand and the way in which the derivation of those equations to clear a market has to, is represented in this, like you say, a piece of paper and,
Yeah,
and describing the first and second welfare theorems. You do that as well as anyone I've ever seen do it in plain language. So you should be applauded for that
thank you.
and really appreciate it. So I find that fascinating because there is a certain beauty of economic theory that those of us who become economists fall in love with. And I don't really see it in other disciplines. Maybe that's because I'm blind, but I see other things in those disciplines, but not that elegance and beauty in the same way. Maybe analytic philosophy could give that to me, but not, not these other places. But that much said, it's also the case that people like you and I, and this communicates in your, there's a bit of Bolding in all of us too, which is, I mean, Kenneth Bolding, because Bolding's the second John Bates Clark Medal winner, but he cast his lot against Samuelson because he said the flawless precision of mathematical economics might lead us into a dead end, as opposed to the literary, what he called the slovenly and literary vagueness of the borderland between economics and sociology. And one of the things I think is fascinating in your memoir is that even from the beginning, while you're being intellectually seduced by the beauty of economics and the core structure, you're already catching on to the idea that there's these social relations and these other kind of things that you need to study. As you say in there, Jonathan Hughes,
Yeah,
yeah. So anyway, I found that, uh, and finding that place. The reason why I thought you'd be, is because like at MIT, did they have that kind of idea even in the say the the conversation, what we just lost Dick Nelson, and Dick Nelson makes this distinction between appreciative theory and formal theory. And I was just wondering if you already sensed that in your education there. That's yeah.
I think so. Although I wouldn't have been able to articulate it in any kind of coherent fashion then, but you just did now, and I resonate to the spirit of what you were just saying. I mean, first year at MIT, the theory sequence included a half semester with a guy called Robert Bishop, which
Huh?
was about cost curves and supply curves and whatnot. And it was as close to a kind of price theory. I can remember him using Friedman's, is it Friedman? There was a price theory kind of note, set of
Yeah.
problems that circulated around. Everybody was using them.
Yeah.
sort of thinking through how to analyze what happens in markets in, kind of messy situations where you could get, some real insight by using the tools of straightforward economics. I remember that. And there were people around, Michael Piori, the labor economist, was one of them who were kind of heterodox in their methodological things and had an appreciation for sociology and philosophy that I respected. But as I say in the book, I mean, the real uh, progenitor of my own eclectic appreciation for stuff, social science stuff that's not reducible to a formalism, uh, came from my undergraduate days with this economic historian,
Yeah.
uh, Jonathan Hughes, who took me under his wing and said, and even when I came back as an assistant professor, my first job out of graduate school, he took me and he said, go over there and talk to the philosophers and talk to the psychologists and talk to the physicists and the mathematicians, sure, but don't be too
Yeah.
narrow and sort of focus, folding in on yourself, because it's a big wide world. Um, and uh, I've tried to pride myself on that intellectual breadth. And
Yeah.
the other thing I say is studying race issues. William Julius Wilson, the great sociologist, had a retirement event at Harvard maybe 4 or 5 years ago, and they asked me to speak, and I reviewed, my interaction with his material. And he has books, uh, that are important interventions in the exploration of questions about race in American society. And I traced out in my remarks, when I first encountered Bill Wilson's book, he had a book called Power, Racism, and Privilege or something like that, which was about South Africa. And I read that book and I didn't understand it at all because I kept trying to find the model. I said, where's the model? What's, kind of, how do we write this down? I mean, come on, can we, be
Yeah.
serious? Uh, and it wasn't until a few years after that, when I had finished my PhD in the late 1970s, and he published a book of his, great book of his called The Declining Significance of Race, that I began to see, well, maybe there is kind of a model, but it's not going to be a set of equations in a system. It's a set of relationships and
Yeah.
insights, and
Yeah.
um, and that was a kind of marker of my intellectual maturity and as it was evolving from my post MIT days.
Yeah.
But um, I don't know what to say. I've always tried to read widely, and tried to uh, keep the insufferably self absorbed kind of worship of formalism at bay.
Yeah. Well, you're an exemplar. So, all of us as economists that, have that love of structure, but need to understand relations, need to learn a lot from you. Just to the group, when I used to teach a course on race, gender, and income inequality at NYU in the Honors College, and one of the books that we read was Wilson's "When Work Disappears," which I think is a fantastic book about basically what happens to the economic ladder when you take off the bottom rung of the ladder, and the consequences of that in general. It's a very very good book, and I think Glenn's discussion of his. I also am quite fascinated by Jonathan Hughes as a character, and his book, which you reference, A Vital Few, is excellent for this group. We should maybe consider reading it one time. But Hughes was this huge influence, despite his own political leanings. He's a major influence on libertarians. Basically through the channel of Bob Higgs and other people like that were very influenced. But he also very influenced on Vernon Smith. When they decided to build the program at Purdue, they said they were going to have theorists and historians. And so Hughes was the historian, economic historian, and then the theorist Radner and those guys or whatever, and that's what they were. Anyway, it's fascinating.
Joel Mokyr too. He was a
Yes,
mentor and influence on Joel Mokyr.
right. Yeah, it's yeah, he's very big. All right, last question for me, which is just a sort of a simple one. It's is that there's your book has so many different threads, that are in it that make it so fascinating because it's not just a memoir of a technical economist, it's not just a memoir of a public intellectual, it's a memoir of a life and many different ways to live. When I was a graduate student, there's this book. I'm not going to remember her name, but I think it's Mary Catherine Batson. She's the daughter of Margaret Mead, but she wrote a book about women constructing a life. And her argument is that men are boring because they just have one thing and then they live their life, whereas women have to have multiple lives that they construct through time as they have these different activities that they engage in. And one of the things about reading your memoir is it's definitely not boring, right? It's all the other things entailed, which we don't have to go necessarily into, but you constructed a life through time in a various different ways. Standing where you are now, what would you like to say to a young Glenn Loury before he took the car? About what maybe life could hold out for you in the way that you can construct a life.
Oh my. I really did admire my mother's brothers, Alfred and Adler. I thought they were just so cool, so manly, uh, that they had, savoir-faire, that they moved through life with ease, and I actually didn't see the feet of clay. I didn't see the insubstantiality of the foundation that they were standing on.
Yeah.
Uh, I didn't see what was really important, you know, um, their quest for sexual gratification and conquest, and their neglect of the cultivation of the higher dimensions of the spirit. I didn't see what was missing there, and I wish that I could have had countervailing influences. I wasn't as close to my father as I might have been because my mother and father split up when I was quite young. My father did, in his life, model and represent a counterpoint to my uncles, but I didn't see it. I thought my dad, I mean, for a long time, I thought my dad was a chump. I thought he was a Boy Scout. You know, I thought he played by the rules. Who the hell plays by the rules?
Yeah.
You know, what a mistake that was. I didn't, I mean, in retrospect, I do hint at this in the book when I tell the story about my uncle Adler coming by to visit my father shortly after I was born, and them sitting and finishing off a bottle of scotch where my uncle Adler did most of the drinking and most of the talking. And I allow as how my dad years later told me this story. Adler crashed and burned. He died in his early 60s, an alcoholic wreck.
Yeah.
He was brilliant. He was a contemporary of Martin Luther King Jr. at Morehouse College. He was a graduate of the Northwestern University School of Law in the early 1950s, where, that was just not something that Black people did. He had a very promising career as an attorney in Chicago, and it came down crashing around his head because he got caught up in some illicit transactions that became public and ruined him. He ended up getting disbarred. Uh, and, my dad was trying to tell me, you can be brilliant, but if you don't have focus, if you don't have discipline, if you don't have a kind of structure that grounds your life in something meaningful, All of that brilliance is not going to do that much for you. And I really wish that I hadn't waited until my 50s to kind of understand that point.
Yeah.
It might have made me more sensitive to my responsibilities, more confident in the set of disciplines and restraints that are necessary to live decently. It may have made me more mindful of the impact that I was having on other people, my wives, my children. Um, uh, I can't go back and undo that. All I can do is put one foot in front of the other, which I have been trying to do. And you know how the book concludes.
Yeah.
So again, I'm not sure I'm being responsive to your question. You're asking me what advice would I have for the young Glenn Lowry in light of a life lived fully, and you know uh, that's what I think to say in response to that question.
Well, I mean, I think that the message that I get from reading the book is one of tremendous resilience. So it's in that sense, it's a message about resiliency. I think is important to get across. One last thing for me is I just want to say that one of the best talks I've ever seen was a talk that you gave on relations before transactions. And it was a public lecture. About 500 people were there. It was at a conference, but you gave it, and it was an extremely powerful talk, and it has had a huge impact in the way that I think about the interaction between political, legal, economic, and social institutions and the play between all of them and the glue that's required in that. And I really hope that I want to go on record as saying this. I really hope that you get a call from Sweden for your work on social economics. We nowadays give them in groups, so I'm hoping that someday they'll award for economic sociology and give the award to you and to Granovetter and maybe Viviana Zelizer, and some kind of idea, all the people who have focused on this issue of relations and transactions. So thank you for your work and also for this, peak and very, obviously honest and, raw discussion of your life. So I want to open it up to the group now. And Victoria wins the prize because she was the one that was most entrepreneurial in advance. But please raise your hand and you'll get called on. And, go ahead, Victoria.
Hi, Glenn. I got to tell you, Pete just reminded me, you have a passage where you describe the joy you felt when you were talking about two planes coming together on a graph. And
Yeah.
and it, as someone who did a lot of math in her younger years, it just brought that joy back of doing math and having all the formulas work and the graph so beautiful. So I thank you for that, but that's not the question. So I am curious about the social capital concept that you bring up in your 1976 paper about dynamic theory of racial inequality. And so here we are 50 years later, and social capital is still in play, but doesn't really have a firm sort of basis of definition. And so back when you wrote that paper, it seemed as if you were describing a concept that exists in a subgroup, I think you call it. And let's take the example of your uncle in the car. Your uncle stepped up and helped you get out of a touchy situation. And that was a draw upon your social capital within your family, perhaps. And in doing so, though, it wasn't really a one-on-one between you and him. It might have been interpreted as an obligation to your sister, an obligation to his mother, or a payback of some sort, maybe of someone else in a family. And so structurally, that social capital seems to exist in sort of a multidimensional plane. Whereas today, and this is the question, do you feel like the concept through James Coleman, Nan Lin, et cetera, has become so linear and it's only existing more on a two-person plane and between two people. And for that reason, it's maybe gone away from your original concept of what social capital is.
I looked into the social capital thing. I used that phrase because I was, trying to juxtapose the ideas that I was expositing in that early paper came out of my dissertation to the Chicago School, Gary Becker, Jacob Mincer, and companies' formulations of human capital. So I was saying, yeah, you can account for different outcomes like earnings and health outcomes and whatnot through thinking about people making investments in themselves of one sort or another, education, formal training, uh, migration, health, and whatnot, and we call that human capital theory, and it's a uh, well trod path. And you can see how ideas about intertemporal investment theory and whatnot from conventional economics could be applied to human resource development in that way. But I wanted to talk about groups and about the influence that your social affiliates would have on your own acquisition of skills and in effect network externalities in the production of human capital, and I was calling that social capital. I didn't have a well developed coherent program of research. I just had a kind of insight that this might be important if I wanted to understand persisting racial disparities. And uh, uh, James Coleman did pick up on it in his Foundations of Social Theory. I think that's 1990, and he credits me. I can even remember my correspondence with Jim Coleman, the late great James Coleman, where I said, you're talking about social capital. You ought to cite me, man. I actually have been talking about social capital since before you were talking about social capital, and very graciously he did cite me in that chapter. And then Robert Putnam picked up on that, and in his uh, uh, stuff about making democracy work, I think is what that book is called, about Italian governance and the indirect beneficial influence for effective government of the existence of informal connections amongst people. He distinguishes between the north and the south of Italy and the effectiveness of local governance, in part by reference to that kind of thing. So I looked into now being identified with a concept where I didn't really, as a social scientist, add very much more than nomenclature and a kind of insight. I appreciate, by the way, Peter, your appreciation of that relations before transactions lecture and essay that's been published in a volume because I am quite proud of as a piece of as an intellectual contribution to the larger question of why does racial inequality persist and whatnot, and uh, so on. But I'm sorry, Victoria, what is your question again?
It just seems people use social capital now as just a measure over a network between two people. And your concept seems to be more that it's a value that's trapped within a subgroup of people. For instance, like to push the point further would be like you had access to capital and people helping you along the way within your family, but other families like you that lived maybe within a mile of you didn't have access to your uncle's help if they got stuck in a bad situation at the police station. And so this concept that you can just move along a network, and if I know this person, then I know that person, and I have access to their assets and or resources is less accurate than what you were describing as far as a group of people working together in a subgroup, in this situation, your family unit, sharing a resource only within your family unit because of these overlapping and multifaceted relationships. So I just was
I
seeing
see.
how social capital was kind of taken away from your vision and put on a singular path of a network.
Yeah, I don't think I have anything useful to contribute other than to appreciate the distinction that you're drawing. So I'll leave it at that.
Okay, Alice.
Hi, can you hear me? Uh, Glenn, thank you for this incredible book. I've learned a lot. I'm still reading it. I'm a high school teacher. I have a very pointed question for you in regard to social capital, intergenerational transfers that you talk about. And it's the current political circumstance of dismantling the Department of Education and the disparity we see in state funding for education and how you see that impacting particularly Black school districts that are already so far behind.
Okay. Well, I don't have a dog in the fight about the Department of Education. I mean, my hope and expectation is that some of the functionality that is housed in the department would find its expression in other places in the government. So um, uh, I don't know that there is, if there's subsidies for low-income people, and if there's the chronicling of academic achievement through the systematic administration of instruments of assessment. Um, if there's oversight of higher education lending programs, which is very substantial, um, and so on. I don't see those things going away, notwithstanding the Department of Education. So I'm not as upset as a lot of people are about the prospect that the Department of Education might be undone. Uh, I mean, this, you're asking me, so I'm going to tell you what I think. I think the teachers unions who control the supply of this critical public service in a lot of jurisdictions with relatively little effective competition, who in their political activities end up bargaining with themselves at contract renegotiation time because they're partly responsible for the political careers of the public representatives sitting on the other side of the table, who steadfastly resist any ideas about innovation of charter schools and all this kind of thing that would increase the influence of parents over the quality of educational services available to their children and would change the strategic in its incentive structure that I think is at play. I am happy to see their influence diminished in the educational sphere. And I say this both because I'm concerned about the quality of education available to inner city youngsters who may be Black or Latino or whatever, uh, but also because I think it's emblematic of a larger set of issues about how public services get delivered and the kind of political economy of public service provision and stuff like that. So, am I being responsive, Alice?
Yes, thank
Okay.
you.
All right, Taylor.
Hi, Glenn. Um, I I loved your book. I went beyond that and started reading some of your other papers, and I think it was maybe in the paper Relations Before Transactions. Um, there was an idea in that I'd never heard before that it just kind of hit me with a thunderclap. You talk about race being a social construct. Um, and when I'm out and about these days, I see a lot of interracial couples, but you make the point, and I'm not sure it's in that paper or some other paper, that if you just look statistically, if there were no like racial barriers, we would expect to see a lot more intermarriage. And then you also make the point that race is actually endogenous in the system. It's not something outside the system, it's something we create. And I thought that was just I never thought about that before. I never thought about things that way before. Could you talk a little bit more about that?
Yeah. So this is a very important set of ideas for me because I'm tasking myself. I don't know if you noticed the prologue of that essay, Relations Before Transactions. It has appeared in various guises. It's a dialogue, an imagined dialogue between two social scientists who happen to be Black, one of whom is a guy like me who's trained formally in economic theory, and the other is a kind of Durkheimian, not Durkheimian. Who am I trying to think of here? Foucaultian. I mean, he's a kind of French theoretical sociologist, and the problem is, how do you explain the persistence of racial inequality if you don't want to assume that Black people are inherently inferior, and you believe that markets really do work, and you follow a kind of Beckerian price theoretic assessment of what the ultimate implications of existing of discriminatory preferences would be, which would be something like, maybe some segregation in the structure of transactions, but arbitrage is going to take care of a lot of the problem. Then how can you explain the persistence of racial inequality? So that's kind of the driving engine behind this set of thoughts on my part. I'm trying to give an account that is not discrediting to the inherent capacities of African Americans. In my book, The Anatomy of Racial Inequality, I even adopt as a kind of axiom a claim, which I don't know is true, which is that there aren't any deep, biologically mediated, genetically conveyed differences between these population aggregates that are in part responsible for the persistence of disparity in socioeconomic outcomes between them. I don't know that that's true. I mean, it's an item of faith for me in effect. I mean, I think the you could take a guy like Charles Murray and Richard Herrnstein, and you can say, you know, bad people, bad people, bad people. But that doesn't actually answer the question. I mean, it's a ultimately it's an empirical kind of scientific matter, and it's open. I mean, you could say that, but I don't want to say that. I want to bind myself to a different kind of vision about racial difference. Um, and so that's where my networks matter, who you're connected to, and all of that for what you actually make of your gifts. The social capital thing comes in, and that's where, if I'm talking about race, the idea that race is produced through selective affiliation and intimate association, which reflects people's ideas about their identity and so on, comes in. And I therefore can make a case that the fact of racial difference is in part derivative from racial difference in economic outcome and achievement is downstream from the prior patterns of intimate association, which are consequential because the acquisition of skills is partly influenced through these spillovers within these networks, this kind of thing.